Hello and welcome to the second episode of the new podcast that does exactly as it says on the tin, Joe and Toby Talk. Today, myself and my co-host Toby, or TIJ Gaming, are discussing the fall from grace for one of F1's most famous teams, Ferrari. Following the announcement of Vettel leaving the team and Carlos Sainz joining in 2021, we discuss just what has went wrong since their last title back in 2007. The podcast is available on Spotify and YouTube, so make sure you follow our page over on Spotify and subscribe to both myself, Captain Goodspeed, and Toby TIJ Gaming on YouTube. Let's get into it.
Today we're going to be talking about the demise of Ferrari, the fall of grace of Ferrari. Their last championship was in 2007 with Kimi Raikkonen. Nearly got there in 2008, nearly got there in 2010, nearly got there in 2012, nearly got there after that. Do you notice the pattern? Nearly got there. So the last time Ferrari won a championship was 2007. Kimi won the championship in 2007 by a singular point. In 2008, Massa came close. In 2009, it was a write-off. Massa had that terrible crash in Hungary, and the team were well off the pace in that season. It was a very strange year in Formula 1 besides, but P6 was the highest one of their drivers finished. Giancarlo Fisichella finished P8 for Ferrari. Remember when he drove for Ferrari? No, me neither. 2010, Raikkonen out, Alonso in. Alonso very nearly wins the championship, but in 2010, that number one driver came back. We had it in 2006 with Massa and Schumacher. Beforehand, we had it with Barrichello and Schumacher. And the number one driver was back in force, particularly in Germany. Fernando is faster than you, Felipe. So then in 2014, Felipe Massa leaves the team, goes to Williams. Kimi Raikkonen joins again. Who would have thought he'd have come back after 2009? Absolutely no one, but Kimi flops. And after that, Fernando Alonso leaves the team. He goes to McLaren to join the new McLaren Honda project, which would win championships again like Ayrton Senna did back in the day. Again, that's a similar story to Ferrari, isn't it? Vettel came in 2015, and 2015 to 2018 were the Vettel and Raikkonen years. Vettel was the number one driver, Raikkonen the number two, but Vettel came close, but never won it. 2019, Charles Leclerc's in, the Monegasque driver, joined Sebastian Vettel, and much like when Vettel was at Red Bull in 2014, a younger driver ruffled the feathers of Vettel, and at the end of this 2020 season, Vettel leaves the team and Sainz joins. Carlos Sainz, an unbelievable name to get to Ferrari, don't you think, Joe?
Yes, definitely. I think a lot of us thought his only chance of a top seat would be at Red Bull, and when that passed on by, joining McLaren seemed to be his long-term future, and it's just crazy how things have developed over the last couple of days, and how three of the big names in Formula 1 just seem to be moving around like nobody's business before the season has even begun properly. So very, very strange.
Yeah, definitely. I was quite expecting Vettel to leave Ferrari at the end of this year, to be honest. I could tell that his feathers had been ruffled by Leclerc last year, and it just wasn't working. But the problem for Vettel was where to go next. But equally, my problem was, well, who did Ferrari get in to replace him? I just didn't have any idea. The top name that I think both of us would have suggested was Daniel Ricciardo. And when the news come out that Sainz was being considered, that was more of a pipe dream. Those classic rumours that you get that someone's in talks and then it ends up being the one that's everybody's expected. But I can't believe Carlos Sainz got that seat. But just a quick chat about Daniel Ricciardo going to McLaren, leaving Renault and going to McLaren. The McLaren team were quite nice in wishing Sainz well at Ferrari. The Renault team, not so much. Just saying that, well, especially at these times, it's all about unity, and Daniel's left, so that's what we think of that go swivel. So, Ricciardo leaves Renault into McLaren. I mean, this just gets crazier and crazier, and of course we've still got to decide where Vettel falls in now, so absolutely mad. But I think that Ricciardo going to McLaren is certainly a good career move, because that move to Renault has just not paid off, has it?
Well, I mean, he's only been there the year at the moment. We don't know what Renault's pace will be in 2020, but I think he was trying to do the Hamilton method of joining a team just before they get really good with Renault, and I think I'd be very interested to see what he would do if the regulation changes hadn't been delayed. if they were still coming in 2021, I'd be interested to see whether Ricciardo may have stayed at Renault. But I suppose we'll never know. Is the apt phrase there, and I really do hope Ricciardo does well at McLaren. I think him and Norris will make a decent combination, and it should be a strong team, just as strong as Sainz and Norris was last year. So I think McLaren have got themselves a good pairing.
Definitely, I agree. I think that Renault were expected to be fourth last year by quite some way. They had that problem where they just couldn't catch up to the top teams, but were in a league of their own. But seems that 2019 that wasn't the case. McLaren came to be the pace team really on most occasions, which is a big shock. But today's about Ferrari, not necessarily about the driver market. And in this podcast, myself and Joe are going to go through and analyse every single driver from 2007, apart from Badua and Fisichella. I think that's fair enough that we don't talk about those too much. I mean, Badua's best moment was when he crashed into, was it Suttil's car at Valencia when he come back into the pits? I think it was Adrian Suttil.
I think it was.
Oh dear, how did he ever get a drive at Ferrari? I just can't believe that. And remember, about the same time, Romain Grosjean was in as well, wasn't he? Who was he in for? Was it Nelson Piquet?
Nelson Piquet Jr. got sacked, and it was Grosjean that came in. But believe it or not, it was actually Schumacher that was going to be Massa's replacement for the rest of the season.
Could you imagine that? How differently his story could have played out.
Yeah. I mean, if Schumacher came in and actually performed at Ferrari, who knows whether Ferrari would have kept him on the next year. But I mean, it was widely sort of thought of that they had Alonso in for 2010 at that point anyway, so it would have been crazy to see it. Maybe they wouldn't have brought Massa back after his injury. Who knows? But that's just the way it happens. A neck injury kept Schumacher out of it, and the rest they say
quite unbelievable, really. Quite unbelievable. That's over 10 years ago now, and just looking beforehand, the Hockenheim moments 10 years ago, it's quite unbelievable. But let's talk first about Felipe Massa. Of course, he had that long stint all the way from 2006 up to 2013. If I'm not mistaken, I mean, Schumacher's the longest serving, isn't he? But Schumacher, I think that apart from Schumacher, Massa is the longest serving. Certainly he's the longest serving out of the six, surely, because he had certainly in one stint anyway, because he did 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Kimi's done 8 years now. So in two stints, Kimi's done 8 years, but Massa's done 8 years in that one stint. Quite unbelievable, really, when he joined the team in 2006 to partner Michael Schumacher. We had a few years in 07, 08 and 09 where they were both considered equals, but in-team politics, etc. meant that Kimi Raikkonen left at the end of 09, and then Fernando Alonso came in. But just imagine, really, Felipe Massa wins the championship in 2008, and Ferrari have 2 in a row, and the complexion of things change a lot. But equally, you have to say that 2009 was such a year that maybe it wouldn't have changed things, because 2009 was just crazy, wasn't it? With Brawn coming through Red Bull. I think even if Felipe Massa had won the championship, that probably 2008 still would have been the last championship that Ferrari won.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with that, because it was so close with Massa winning or not winning the championship. He was famously world champion for 40 seconds or something like that, and the performance of the 2009 car would have been exactly the same, and from then you've got to say history would have panned out the way it did. Now, the only other question would be, would Massa have been a better driver in 2010 on his comeback, knowing that he was a world champion? I don't know. I really don't know, and it's up for debate whether Massa was the same driver after his injury in
Well, I think he had 2 big knocks at the end of the day, because he had that injury and he lost the title as well. That must have been a massive blow to him. In those first 4 races then in 2009, so used to calling it 2010s. I mean, 2020s is still scary, but the fact that's 2 decades ago technically now, it's mind-boggling. But not to score any points in those first 4 races and only have 1 podium up to Germany, it's just unbelievable, isn't it? Ferraris took such a nosedive in 2009, but then so did McLaren. So I don't think we could really blame Ferrari at this juncture.
Yeah, it was a strange one in 2009 because it was the first big regulation change for quite some time, and I know Red Bull had put a lot of thought into that, similar to 2014 with Mercedes, and I know Honda put a lot of thought into that, and then obviously Brawn took over Honda, and Ferrari and McLaren were trying to outdevelop each other all the way until the final race of the season in Brazil in 2008, so they had a lot less time to get their heads around KERS and just the whole difference in aerodynamics. I remember it quite well, actually, how they started the season. I think Hamilton might have went out in Q1 in Australia,
I think that's
despite
right, yeah.
being the world champion. So, but McLaren seemed to certainly get on top of the development throughout the year, and by the end of the season, I think Hamilton had won 3 or 4 races. So yeah, you sort of can blame Ferrari by the end of the year, because I think McLaren and Red Bull ended up with the quickest cars. I think it's a common known fact. Brawn dropped off like a stone. And Ferrari never seemed to catch up. And I think Kimi was well under par that year, and I think that's what affected them in the end. They only had one driver for half a season because Fisichella didn't score any points for Ferrari, and obviously Badoer before that was barely qualifying in 20th. So it was just a strange year for everyone involved in Ferrari.
Absolutely. I mean, we wouldn't focus on this year too much if it was just a normal one, but the next year Raikkonen's out, so that pattern from 07 to 09 is finished, and particularly because all of a sudden it's not just a world champion now, but a 2-time world champion in Fernando Alonso, and all of a sudden from the 2010 days it was Alonso's the number one driver, and that was shown particularly by those team orders in Hockenheim, which we've discussed earlier. The fact that Felipe was told that Fernando's faster than you. I mean, the days when Rob Smedley was Master's race engineer, I mean, it just seems all so nostalgic now. But 2010 was another great year as well, with of course Michael Schumacher's comeback. We said earlier that he could well have been at Ferrari. Imagine how that would have changed things. But 5 victories for Fernando Alonso in 2010. Obviously Massa didn't win a race after that Brazilian Grand Prix. That's a stat and a half, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it definitely is. But I'll always remember that Bahrain Grand Prix in 2010, and it was a Ferrari 1-2, I believe, and it was Alonso from Massa, and Massa wasn't too far behind. And I actually think for probably the first half of that season, Ferrari were probably looking at it as Alonso and Massa as equals. As far as Ferrari were concerned, Massa had, the last thing he did in a competitive car.
This has been the strategy for every year since, hasn't it? Really, to treat them as equals, allegedly at least, and then focus their attention on the main driver in the second half. Yeah.
I think that's what happened. Massa, I think, started out 2010 pretty good. He was obviously, it was his comeback from the injury, and for some reason he just seemed to drop off further and further until he left Ferrari. But I think Alonso proved himself as maybe the best pound for pound driver in Formula 1 during those years, and it would have took a great team leader to not prioritise Alonso in the championship, I think, because he just seems to drag anything up to decent positions apart from McLaren Honda, but we'll talk about that another time.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So
Felipe Massa, the first driver that you could argue that maybe Ferrari ruined.
Yeah, I think possibly. We don't know what the impact of the injury was on Massa and how good he was, but certainly when he moved to Williams, he seemed to find himself again. So, I think it's a perfectly valid question. Did Ferrari ruin Massa? And it wasn't necessarily Ferrari. More one race, I think. I think Hockenheim 2010 was what ruined Massa, and after that he never seemed the same to me.
Well, it must be, mustn't it?
Now.
It must be a dent in confidence to be told that, look, you've got to move over for your teammate. Remember, of course, back in 2010, team orders weren't allowed. The team were fined £100,000. They kept the win because, well, their name's Ferrari. I don't need to say anymore. But they kept the win. But they were fined £100,000. But those two races, the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix, I still can't believe that stat that's his last race he won. And that Hungarian Grand Prix were two massive races for Massa. So I think for this, I don't really think we can call it bad management. I just think that potentially Massa lost his way. We can attribute some of it to the team management, particularly with that German Grand Prix. But truthfully, much like other drivers that have gone through a similar thing, I don't think Massa was ever the same driver, was he, after that accident in 2009?
No, I don't think he was. He never really had that sharpness, and it's perfectly understandable. He had a horrible accident, head injury, which is the worst type of injury you can get, and he nearly died. let's be blunt about it. He could well have been the first driver death since Ayrton Senna at that point, and he pulled through it. He didn't race again in 2009, and possibly came back too soon in 2010. Maybe that's what did it, but he was never the same after that, and I think that's what we can put down to what changed Massa. But as you say, I think there's a multitude of reasons. Germany 2010 is definitely one of them, and probably the media being on his back a lot as well. I think a lot of media, particularly in 2012, I seem to remember saying Massa was well past it, and constant pressure on who's going to replace Massa rather than let's actually support Massa in this. But that's their job at the end of the day, and I do kind of feel sorry for Massa.
The 2012 debate as well, of course, we had the most champions on the grid in 2012, didn't we? And with that degree of competition, you're bound to feel pressure. I mean, 2009, Jenson Button, Sebastian Vettel, I mean, any of those four drivers who finished in the top four, the two Brauns and two Red Bulls, hadn't really made a name for themselves, certainly in a big team. But by 2012, we'd got a multitude of champions and equally a multitude of drivers also that had made names for themselves. And Pastor Maldonado won a race in that season, and Sergio Perez nearly won a race that year. But the best that Felipe Massa could do is a second place in Japan, and that was it. And he got one other podium all season. So that just shows how Massa got on that year. Whereas Fernando had 3 wins, he had 5 second places, and also plenty of third places as well. So very consistent. Of course, Fernando nearly took that 2012 championship, and that's where we're going to go to next. Our second of the 4 main drivers to be mentioned today, Fernando Alonso, entering the sport in the early 2000s, the same as Felipe Massa, and in 2010 finally joined the Tifosi as the 2-time world champion. Of course, Kimi and Lewis and Jenson winning the championships after him. So we had an interesting dynamic on the grid in 2010 with still one champion at the Ferrari. We've had that every year I'm interested in looking what year that is. When is the last time that Ferrari did? I suppose they entered the year in 2007 without a champion, didn't they? But it's got to be a long time ago now, going back where they had a season without 2 champions. That's quite unbelievable. But Fernando Alonso joined the team in 2010, left the team at the end of 2014 to go to McLaren Honda. Very nearly won the championship twice. Do you think that the reason Fernando didn't win the championship is a certain German?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I think 2010, the reason Alonso didn't win the championship was
Vitaly Petrov.
Yeah, it was pit stop strategy.
Yeah.
Vettel was the least likely out of the 4 drivers that had a chance on the last day to win the title, and he did it because he had the best pit stop strategy. And how different the world would have been had he not won the world championship that day. He hadn't led the championship at all that season until the very last moment. So yeah, the reason Alonso didn't win 2010 was because of pit stop strategy. 2012, I still don't know how he didn't win it. He was 40 odd points ahead after Belgium, I think, and yeah, I suppose Vettel winning 4 races on the spin is probably the reason why Alonso didn't win that 2012 championship. So I suppose in a way you could say a certain German stopped Alonso dominating the sport during his Ferrari time.
It's quite upsetting, I think, when it comes to Alonso, because we could be looking at a 4, maybe 5-time champion, because for me, I think that he has a very strong case, along with Vettel, Hamilton. I think those are probably the only 2 that you can seriously consider to be the best driver of our generation. Obviously, if you take Schumacher out of the occasion from 2005 onwards, I feel like those 3 are the best equipped to be in that battle. And Alonso, with some of the cars that he pulled, I mean, Ferrari weren't the force that they were by this point. I feel like 2010 to 13, Red Bull had the best car, didn't they? McLaren had a solid car. The Mercedes were up there, and there were some variable results. But the problem was that in most occasions, you had Red Bull and McLaren that were quicker than them. Of course, by 2014, by the time that rolled around, on most occasions, Ferrari were the 4th quickest team. And again, it was really just a one-man band. And this was Ferrari's problem. By the time that Alonso came to the team, they'd changed their strategy. They didn't really treat their drivers as equals. They said they did, publicly. But I don't think that was the case, because it was quite inevitable that, particularly in the Alonso Massa day, that Alonso was going to be the lead driver. By the mid-session interval, I was going to say, I'm thinking snooker now. The mid-season break after Hungary, and then would support him through the rest of the season. You can see that particularly in 2012, where, apart from that terrible retirement in Belgium, that doesn't feel too far away at all. That monstrous crash with Grosjean Kobayashi. I can still reenact the commentary, which is incredibly sad. And that retirement in Japan as well. But apart from that, in every race he got a podium, and that is quite an incredible run. In fact, in Hungary he finished 5th, but going back to the Valencian Grand Prix, he won that. Got 2nd in Britain, got 1st in Germany. So every race he finished, apart from Hungary again, from that European Grand Prix run to Brazil, he got a podium in. So mighty impressive from Fernando. Meanwhile, Felipe got 2 podiums in that time and got a smashing of points, a few 4th places, a few 5ths, but pretty mediocre results, it has to be said. But Fernando Alonso, certainly an interesting one. 5 years at Ferrari and just didn't achieve his aim. Again, Vettel's going to have been there 6 years and not achieved his aim of winning the championship. But by the time 2014 rolls around, because that's what I really want to analyse now, 2014, when the fallout started, because I think this was quite a big year. Of course, the end of 13, going into 14, Domenicali leaves. Just how much of an impact did that have, do you think? Because we've had Mattiacci, Arriva Beni, Binotto, and so many other names interfering behind the scenes since then.
Yeah, no, I think Stefano leaving the team was probably the last time Ferrari were a happy environment, in my opinion. Yeah. Certainly I don't remember any issues with Alonso at Ferrari before 2014. And he had perfect reason to do so with the car he was given in 2012 and arguably 2011 as well. But no, Stefano Domenicali, I'm not really sure why he left the team, but he's always somebody that I remember being an excellent team principal, even though he probably didn't deliver the same results that a Ross Brawn may have delivered back in the day. But yeah, it was. I think it was a big impact on the whole team dynamic, and probably one of the reasons why Alonso left at the end of 2014, and I don't think it's ever recovered really.
Absolutely. I mean, Domenicali left after the Bahrain Grand Prix 14 because they hadn't had a podium in the first full race, and he was sacked by De Montezemolo. Mattiacci comes in, and well, from then that's been a bit of a disaster. That's a real poignant moment in the history of Ferrari, I think, because, as you say, after he left, it just wasn't a happy environment. Things kept changing, and I think behind the scenes there were too many people meddling in the boardroom behind the scenes ultimately, and I think Fernando saw a better opportunity with McLaren Honda. It was never going to work with Ferrari, and Mercedes didn't want him and Red Bull didn't want him really, and Fernando had dug himself a hole, especially with those top teams, by little different things he'd said. Of course, that'd get even worse during the McLaren years. But Fernando Alonso, again, another one that could have been a champion. But I think actually I think potentially he was only denied maybe one championship because of the team. I just think in 2012, he was just so unlucky. I mean, I think everybody in the world, after Vettel spun in Brazil, Fernando's won it. Fernando's a 3-time champion. And I just cannot believe Vettel come back to win that. So he was just really unlucky. Again, really unlucky that he retired in Belgium. Not his fault at all. Can't remember what happened in Japan, admittedly. But I certainly remember that Belgium one. I think it was
an incident with Webber or Grosjean. Might have been Grosjean at the start of the race.
I know Grosjean hit Webber at the start, but I can't remember Alonso being involved in that. I feel
like Alonso was caught up in that.
He could have been. Let's check the Wikipedia page, because Wikipedia is also always the great grain of these. Yes, he was involved in a collision on lap 1, but looks like it might have been with Nico Rosberg. So interesting. God, do you remember that? Schumacher crashed into Jean-Eric Vergne, Singapore, the race before.
Yeah.
Just fell to sleep at the sleep and.
Schumacher had a few of those in the final.
Yeah. I'm just trying to. I think it was Rosberg and Senna hit each other, and then Alonso was involved in the Rosberg-Senna incident. But I genuinely think that 2012 was just such an unlucky year for Fernando Alonso. So I think that these first two drivers weren't so affected by Ferrari. I just think that Alonso was incredibly unlucky. I think that he drove his heart out, and maybe decisions behind closed doors didn't help him. But I feel like Alonso is a bit of a mystery, rather than something that can be explained how he didn't win a championship in his 5 years, don't you think?
I think had Alonso given it one more year at Ferrari, I think Alonso would still be there now. I don't know.
Interesting.
I think 2014 came around. He's seen that Mercedes had developed the best engine. All of the Mercedes-powered teams were better than Ferrari that year, arguably. I know Force India probably not, but they certainly got a few podiums early on, as did McLaren. So I think he looked at that and thought, well, I'm never going to win the World Championship. And he finished P6 that year. But then we seen the very next year Vettel won 3 races. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But I think Alonso would have won the same, if not more, races than Vettel did that year. And I think he'd have still been there today had he not left. Weirdly.
That's really interesting. I've never thought of it like that, but that would be fascinating. So that's Fernando Alonso, the first two drivers covered. Now we come up to everybody's favourite, or second, or potentially third, or potentially fourth. Keke Rosberg, I suppose. Favourite Finn, Kimi Raikkonen, the Iceman. 2 stints at Ferrari, joined the team in 2007 from McLaren. Montoya and Raikkonen, at McLaren 2006.
And Della Rosa and Raikkonen.
God,
don't forget Della Rosa.
Yeah, well, very forgettable. 3 years at Ferrari first off with Massa. We've discussed that before, of course. Won the championship in 2007. The only person we're going to discuss today, maybe apart from Schumacher, that we touched on earlier, who has won a championship with Ferrari. And that is quite unbelievable in 2007. 2008 was off it a little, and in 2009 was particularly. But we've discussed his first stint. His second stint, I think, is where things start to get a lot more interesting, because I think the second stint we saw a different Raikkonen, didn't we? But my question is, did we see a different Raikkonen because of his age or because of the team? Because it was very peculiar. He performed brilliantly. He was arguably the second best driver on the grid in 12 and 13. That Lotus wasn't really a race-winning car, and he won 2 races in Abu Dhabi in Australia and performed really well. His teammate Grosjean as well, they were the dream team, but Raikkonen joined Ferrari and it all of a sudden went very wrong. Now, is that clear then that, well, he did well at Lotus but he did badly at Ferrari? That tells you only one thing.
It's an interesting one with Raikkonen, because by the end of his stint with Lotus, he was getting very ratty with them, and he was getting beaten quite comfortably by Grosjean by the end, and it was just strange, because he, as you say, he'd been probably the second best driver on the grid throughout 2012 and maybe half of 2013, but as soon as Grosjean started beating him, he just seemed to have enough, and I honestly didn't see him staying in the sport in 2014 after some of his races, but then he went to Ferrari, which baffled me at the time. But yeah, there was something different about Raikkonen 2030, the last part of 2013 into 2014, and he got absolutely thumped by Alonso the first year at Ferrari, and finished P12 that year, and that's he might have even finished higher than that last year for Alpha. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, it's probably about right, to be honest.
No, he finished 12th last year for Alfa Romeo. So,
God,
very strange. But I think I don't know. Was he influenced by money? Do you think, Raikkonen? Because I know that's what a lot of his beef with Lotus was about his pay.
Well, he wasn't being paid full stop, was he? So I suppose any rise in money is tempting, but I just think he wanted away from Lotus, and I suppose Ferrari were the only team that came core. And at the end of the day, Massa was going, and who do you turn to? Who did they turn to at that point? They couldn't turn to Vettel. He was still with Red Bull. Obviously, Lewis Hamilton was settled in at Mercedes. Other drivers that were prominent on the grid, Jensen Button, no. Sergio Perez was a no-go after that terrible year at McLaren, although to be fair, Pinoche Perez and Alonso, that would have been interesting. But
well, actually, funnily enough, Webber was often touted as a partner for Alonso. Certainly in the early 2010s, when Massa was underperforming, Webber was hotly tipped because he got on well with Alonso. They thought that would be the perfect fit, but obviously Webber retired in 2013, so they couldn't turn to Webber either. But I think that would have been a really interesting dynamic, Alonso and Webber, because I think certainly Webber is one of the most underrated drivers actually on the grid. But that's a conversation for another day. That's certainly a name that I didn't expect to bring up in today's podcast.
No, certainly not, definitely not. But 2015, Sebastian Vettel joins the team, and not a bad start to 2015 for Kimi. I mean, he finished second in Bahrain, 2 fourths, so not terrible. But again, a season that was fairly marred by inconsistency. Had a few retirements here and there, and wasn't too bad, to be fair. And 2016 rolled about, and I felt like we saw a bit more of a consistent Raikkonen in 2016. Again, the results not all that good, and remember, by this point, Red Bull were number 2, really, and certainly in 15 and 16, I think Williams was certainly up there in 15. I don't know about 16, but
no, I think they dropped off a bit in 2016.
They dropped off a bit in 16.
Because that was Stroll and Massa won it, so I think.
Really?
16.
Surely not that early.
No, it wasn't.
Because
Bottas was still there in 16.
Yeah, obviously Nico Rosberg winning the championship, but I think possibly helped by the craziness that happened at Red Bull that year with Daniel Kvyat and Verstappen and all that nonsense. I mean, Kimi finished P6 in the championship that year. Not too far behind Vettel, but Danny Ricciardo was way ahead of Vettel, Raikkonen or Verstappen. Sergio Perez finished 7th that year. Interesting. But 2017 was, of course, the first serious championship run that Sebastian Vettel had. The new cars in 2017, the new Aero. God, that is quite unbelievable. And again, Kimi didn't really do all that much. I mean, if you look at his results at Ferrari in his second stint, apart from that brilliant win at the US, which is probably still my favourite race in the last few years, it's kind of underwhelming. You could put Felipe Massa's name in there and not really think anything of it.
Well, it's funny that you should say that, Toby, because the thing with Raikkonen, I find, in his second stint at Ferrari, the second half of the season was always an improvement. He always started to get on the podium a couple of times or finish 4th or whatever, which is exactly what Massa used to do in the early 2010s. It would get up to Silverstone where they'd be saying, Massa/Raikkonen are finished. Who's going to replace them? Then Massa/Raikkonen would come back in the second half of the year and get some good results, and all of a sudden they'd be retained for the next year. it's weird, but there's so many parallels between Massa and Raikkonen, and I suppose it shows how equal they were in 2007 and 2008, that they had in their so-called second stint at Ferrari, or second half of their stints, they were so similar to each other. It's very weird.
Do you not think that potentially Raikkonen was caused more by, because the team used to do this a lot, and it really annoyed me as a Raikkonen fan, they would sacrifice Raikkonen a lot in race, wouldn't they? They would put him on a longer strategy, a short strategy, and it would never work, would it, at all?
Yeah, no, he was a victim of Ferrari tactics, as they were. But yeah, I suppose it goes back to the times when Alonso was fighting for the championship. You know, they tactically used Massa to better the chances of Alonso, and I suppose 2018 was the best example of that, because Ferrari had probably the best car on the grid for a lot of that season.
But I seem to remember even like as far back as China and Baku, particularly in 18, Raikkonen was sacrificed straight away.
Yeah, and you know, looking at Raikkonen's performances at the start of the season, he got a third in Australia, retired in Bahrain, third in China, second in Baku. You know, he didn't finish. If he finished the race, he finished it in the top 6 for the whole season.
I was quite excited to see Raikkonen in that year, because, to be quite honest, had he not retired from Spain and Bahrain, we could be talking about a title contender, because Vettel didn't have such a great start to the year. Yes, he won the 2 races, which seems ridiculous to say that he didn't have a very good start to the year, but after that he tailed off. Didn't win again until Canada, and then Britain and then Belgium, and then after that it just went completely to pot. But Germany was the big turning point with Vettel, but Vettel we're going to talk about next. But yeah, I think that 2018 was probably Raikkonen's strongest year, which is why it's so bizarre that Raikkonen was let go at the end of 2018.
Yeah, I suppose it was his strongest year, but he was, 4 points off finishing in 5th, which, if we look at it on paper, was about his performance in the previous 3 years for Ferrari. So, I think they were probably looking at Raikkonen as not somebody that can challenge for the title anymore. Just because of that consistency. I think, although 2018 was a very consistent year, he was consistently slower than Vettel, I think, was the overall problem with their sort of teammate years. And
but you could argue the same. You could argue the same with Valtteri Bottas, but Mercedes aren't like that. Mercedes, yes, they're the quickest car, sure, but it's not made so obvious. I don't think that Bottas is.
Yeah, I think Bottas is helped a lot by Hamilton, because Hamilton scores so many points. Mercedes tend to dominate the Constructors' Championship, and I'm not saying Bottas, doesn't contribute to that, but if we look at the points difference between a Hamilton and a Bottas, and then a Vettel and a Raikkonen, for instance, Ferrari are losing out to.
Is a big part of Kimi being kept on because of the relationship between the two of them.
Yeah, I suppose so, and I think Vettel knew he could beat Raikkonen, or thought he could beat Raikkonen, and I think Vettel was quite happy with Kimi as a teammate. I remember a few times when they asked about maybe the possibility of Ricciardo joining him, and Vettel would always say he'd prefer Kimi. And I don't think that was just because of the relationship between the two. I think it's because Vettel was probably the slightly better driver during those years, and slightly more consistent and slightly more likely to win a race at random than Kimi was. So I think that's probably the reason Raikkonen was there for so long. But
one win in those 5 years for Raikkonen, coming right
more
at the
than
end.
Massa though. By the end, he did better than Massa.
Yeah, at least we can say that Raikkonen went out on a high, can't we? Rather than with Massa, where it just dwindled, and then he just left, and then went to Williams. So what's your final judgment of Raikkonen? Was it the team? Was it just that maybe that he wasn't the right driver, and once they'd got him, they were stuck with him because of a few certain factors like the Vettel factor, and was he just a victim of circumstance?
I think a combination of all of those reasons. I think Raikkonen, the Raikkonen Ferrari got wasn't as good as the Raikkonen that Ferrari thought they were going to get. We said he was one of the best drivers on the grid in 2012-13. I think Ferrari genuinely thought Raikkonen was going to be a lot better, a much better teammate for Alonso, trying to make ground in the Constructors' Championship. But, over the years, I think a lack of consistency for Raikkonen cost him. But towards the end, I think 17 and 18 were undoubtedly the best years for Raikkonen at Ferrari. And in those years, Ferrari were the ones that ruined his chances for doing a lot better. But
I mean, exactly. I think that, I keep saying this, but certainly in 18 he could have been a championship contender, but Ferrari just can't cope with that. Really have never been able to cope. I think probably that Raikkonen Massa period was probably where they did it best. But since then, it's been very much a 1 and 2 basis, and I think that's what the problem was at Ferrari, that he couldn't be seen to win. When he got that pole in Monza, it was only because the team made a mistake.
Yeah,
I mean, that's ridiculous, isn't it? And the effect that must have on a driver is ridiculous, knowing that really you shouldn't be winning, you should be backing up your teammate, and when you do win it, it's almost frowned upon. I mean, obviously, by the time we got to the US, it was known that Leclerc was the winner, so the winner. No, well, I suppose he was the winner against Raikkonen and getting that seat, but Raikkonen was out by then, so it was almost like, stuff it, I've got nothing to prove, so let's just go for it. So I think Raikkonen's an interesting one as well. I think Raikkonen is the most interesting out of all three we've discussed so far, because of course he had the 2 stints. We had the break from 2009, he wasn't in F1 until 2012, but the unusual factor here is that he did so well at the team he was at previously and then just didn't cut it in those 5 years. That's where things get a little bit bizarre on Kimi Raikkonen. But let's talk next about the big man, the man that we've come here to talk about today because of his move to potentially retire, potentially go to Mercedes, potentially go wherever the pundits say he might well go. And that is Sebastian Vettel. Joined the team in 2015. He had won 4 out of the last 5 titles, and surely every man and his dog would have thought in the next 6 years he would have won at least 1 title.
Yeah, unless you believed Mercedes were going to absolutely dominate the sport, and we were always told Mercedes were going to be good in 2014, and I don't think anybody truly believed it. But they did. They came out in 2014 and have won every title since. So, but yeah, I agree. I mean, Vettel won 4 on the trot, and it's almost unbelievable that he's only finished runner-up twice since then, and a very distant runner-up at that.
Absolutely. I think that the first 2 years we can't really talk about much because they were almost bedding in years for Sebastian Vettel. He got his first win at the Malaysian Grand Prix in 2015. Didn't get a win after that until Hungary, and then in Singapore as well, which back in that day Mercedes were quite synonymous with being poor at. But I think the bit where we want to focus on with Vettel is 2017, because that was his first serious run at going for a title. Was 2017, and he was close but just didn't do it. Retired in Singapore. I can't believe that crash with Raikkonen was all the way back in 2017 now. I can't believe it's that long ago. Retired in Japan, but ultimately Lewis Hamilton was just too good that year.
I'm looking at the results of 2017 right now, and I'm struggling to work out how Vettel was actually as close as he was. I'm looking at the amount of wins Hamilton had. He didn't retire all year. He had 1 dodgy race in Mexico, and Hamilton only finished 46 points ahead of Vettel.
Yeah.
And Vettel had 2 DNFs. If Vettel finishes second in both of those races, Hamilton only wins it by 10 points. How does that happen? Looking at those results, that just seems bizarre to me. But no, you're right. Vettel started that year winning in Australia, second in China, won again in Bahrain, second in Russia, second in Spain, won in Monaco. So first 6 races for Vettel, he didn't finish outside the top 2, but as we've seen,
the first sign of Vettel weakness, Azerbaijan 2017, Hamilton and Vettel come to blows in a way that we haven't seen between two of the greats for a long, long time, and that was the start of where things got interesting, because it was all pally-pally before. It was a good title battle, and then all of a sudden the gloves were off.
I think it was very surprising. We haven't seen that sort of edginess since, maybe Multi-21, I suppose, would be the last time we've really seen that, outrage at the end of a Grand Prix.
Definitely.
But it was a sign of weakness in a way. It showed that Hamilton had got in his head, and I'd love to work out the points at that stage of the season, but I wonder how many points Vettel was ahead of Hamilton going into that Grand Prix. I must imagine it would have been quite a lot, but it sort of showed that I don't know, Hamilton was living rent free, as they say.
Well, after the Canadian Grand Prix, Vettel was on 141, Hamilton 129.
Yeah.
12-point gap. And then after Baku, obviously Vettel did he finish ahead? Yes, he did. So 153 for Vettel, 131 for Lewis. And to be fair, Valtteri Bottas still had a slight chance then at 111. Again, props to Valtteri, who wasn't actually doing too bad at that point, to be honest. He was obviously helped, and bloody Lance Stroll getting a podium. Christ, you won't be able to believe that one, will you? But where did it go wrong for Vettel in 2017? I feel like that by this point, the team just wasn't working. That double retirement in Singapore showed a lot, didn't it? Both of them
I think
retires.
I think that was undoubtedly the turning point, because Vettel would have won that race probably. Ferrari had qualified 1 and 2, I believe, and
1 and 4.
1 and 4, sorry. Vettel on pole, I presume.
Yeah.
Vettel would have more than likely went on to win that Grand Prix, and potentially we'd have been sitting here saying he won the championship. But Hamilton went on to that streak of 5, even 6 in 8 races he won, and finished second in another one. So I think that was the turning point of that year, and probably the turning point of Vettel's Ferrari career, because up until that point, as we say, 2015 and 2016 he was bedding in, he was getting better and better in that Ferrari car was getting better with him. 2017 he was leading the championship for more than half of it, and then that strike point in Singapore I think ultimately changed the course of the rest of Vettel's Ferrari career, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. Even though Hamilton had won the last 2 races, going into Singapore, he was only 3 points ahead of Vettel. Obviously, after the Singapore Grand Prix, Hamilton had a 28-point lead.
Yeah.
And he wasn't going to recover that after that, because Hamilton was so strong. And that was it. Vettel then retired in Japan, I remember that, and that was a mechanical issue, and that was it for Vettel. So, again, I think that we're not blaming the team as much as I thought we would do here. I just think in 2017... Vettel was perhaps unlucky, and I'll maybe take back my comment that Hamilton was so good, because if we look at it, if you take those 2 races out of the equation, we should really be looking at Vettel being the champion. I think that Japan and Singapore he couldn't really do a lot about. Azerbaijan he absolutely could.
I must admit, I don't remember how he retired from the Japanese Grand Prix. So
it was a mechanical issue.
So he wasn't going to win that anyway. If you think of it that way, he was going to win Singapore. I think Hamilton would have won it in the end. Looking at that anyway. But that Singapore race would have really hurt Vettel, and his results didn't really recover that year after that.
And then after that, we've got 2018. Vettel wins the first two races. For the second year running, Ferrari win the first race of the year. Vettel wins again in Bahrain. And we're suddenly going, hello, Vettel's back at it again. You know, after the terror of last year, Vettel's back, bouncing and doing really well. And, of course, I remember very vividly, halfway into the season after the Silverstone Grand Prix, Vettel won it, something that I don't think we'd seen for a long while. Hamilton always won around Silverstone. That was just folklore. And the one year I decided not to go, Hamilton didn't win. Typical. And after that race, Vettel's 8 points ahead. It's close, but it was a really, really good battle between the two, wasn't it? It was really close. And then we have the German Grand Prix.
Yeah.
On the Saturday, Lewis goes out of Q2 with a problem. Qualifies in 14th. Vettel goes on pole. Damages Lewis as much as possible. But then the unthinkable happens. It rains, albeit only slightly. And certainly not as much as the next year it would. And Vettel crashes. And all of a sudden, the season turns on its head. Hamilton takes the lead from Vettel. And Vettel never regains that lead back.
Yeah. I mean, it's ingrained in my memory, seeing Vettel, just the frustration when he crashed the car. And, for Hamilton to qualify 14th, you said he was already 8 points behind. If Vettel goes on and wins that, Hamilton probably would have gone to the podium anyway. But, it's still another 10 points that Vettel would have pulled out on Hamilton there. And, it was a big turning point because an 8-point lead turned into a 17-point deficit all of a sudden. And just like last year with Singapore, Hamilton was only the odd point ahead of Vettel. And Hamilton gets that victory, and all of a sudden he's 31 points ahead in the championship. And it's just crazy. Vettel has to win another two or three Grand Prix to overturn a 17-point deficit to Hamilton now. So it just puts the pressure bang on Vettel, and he just wasn't able to cope with it for the second half of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. He'd have won 5 races if he'd have won that German Grand Prix in that season. That would have been a really good total, even if he had finished second in the Hungarian Grand Prix. Yeah. Then comes out of the blocks after the summer break, wins Belgium. But then after that, really does nothing spectacular. 2 podiums in Singapore, Russia, 2 podiums in Mexico and Abu Dhabi, but ultimately it was all over from that Germany moment. And you've all of a sudden got, it's another opportunity missed, and all of a sudden 2 opportunities missed for Ferrari. And it just starts to unravel from there. We can spend all day talking about individual races where perhaps Vettel didn't score the points that he needed, but I think ultimately Ferrari were just a little bit unlucky with Vettel, because the form was there. They'd focused on their one driver. The form was there, but at the big points, at the turning points, they could never recover because the Mercedes team were always so consistent. I mean, when a Mercedes driver dropped out of the race, it was a massive shock. If it wasn't reliability, at least anyway. Mercedes drivers never made a mistake, but Singapore, Germany, both crashes for Vettel, and he never really recovered from that. Again, we could be looking at Vettel, the 6-time champion, Lewis only 4, and that's quite amazing to think, really. And then we move on to 2019. So Raikkonen's out at the end of 2018. Charles Leclerc, after a year with Sauber, joins the team. A very unexperienced name to go Ferrari. I can't think of anybody that's been that unexperienced to go to Ferrari. Felipe Massa possibly, but again, he'd had 4 years in F1 before Leclerc.
Yeah.
So very interesting to see Leclerc go there, and much like Vettel with Ricciardo, he didn't like having that teammate. We've talked about it already with preferring Kimi being there, but 2019 was just, the final nail in the coffin really for Vettel. He wasn't in it. He won 1 race all year, which is quite unbelievable, to be honest. Ferrari winning all 3 races after the summer break. But yeah, they just weren't with it, really, were they?
Well, I think if you go back to Germany in 2018 and after that, I seem to remember Vettel making mistakes in Grand Prix regularly, and that continued into 2019 as well. I remember I think he got up to 10 points, 10 penalty points.
Possibly, yeah.
At some point last year, and he was very, very close to getting a race ban, and he was almost becoming what the young folk call a meme at this point. Vettel, was just making.
Well, he'd hit Ricciardo, hadn't he, in the US? I remember that he'd completely butchered that move up.
It was
Ricciardo
Italy
in America,
as well. He spun round in Italy. With
that was
Hamilton,
the year after, to be fair. What's that really 18?
Yeah, I think it was.
Oh God, yeah, it must have been. You're right, because of course, it was on pole, wasn't he? Kimi, again, another turning point. Kimi Raikkonen got pole for that 2018 race where it should have been Vettel. Vettel gets involved with Lewis and spins round, and just like you say,
exactly. We're looking at it with the results on paper, but had Vettel won that Grand Prix, he would have stopped the rot, as it were, and he would have won 2 in a row, wouldn't he? Because he'd won in Spa, and it's ifs, buts, and maybes. But Vettel in 2019, we'll be very disappointed looking back. I know after pre-season testing, people were saying Ferrari were well ahead of Mercedes, but as always, Mercedes pull it out and always seem to be the quickest, and finished 1-2 in the first 5 races in 2019. I mean, arguably, 2019 was Mercedes' most dominant year yet, crazily enough. But no, Vettel will be disappointing, and Leclerc, although he's not as good as, or I don't think he's as good as people make out, certainly came and did the Ricciardo to Vettel.
And without a race in 2020, Vettel has decided to leave. I understand that basically the finances they offered him was humiliating. I understand that he's on around a figure of £35 million and was offered a figure of around £8 million. And that really tells you all you need to know. That he was going to be made the number 2. How could Ferrari treat a 4-time world champion like that? I think that's probably what he was thinking, and they just didn't share the same ambitions anymore. That was the press release, more like they didn't say they share the same contractual thoughts on money. And it's not just about money for Vettel. I think it's the whole reputation and respect that brings. He knows that at 8 million he's going to be playing second fiddle to Leclerc. I mean, personally, I don't think either of us would mind 8 million, but to be in any circumstance, have your wage docked and made a quarter of what it is an humiliation, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think he can really blame anyone but himself, really. I think we'd said it multiple times on our old podcast that Vettel had almost lost his touch, I think, and it was all after that moment in Germany. He was just littered with mistakes. He didn't seem to have the same speed anymore. It was very weird. It's as if a switch had been turned, and then this young, passionate, hungry driver comes into the team, and I think Vettel was maybe just a bit too comfortable having Raikkonen as a teammate and knowing that he did just have that extra 1% over Raikkonen for most of their time together. And Leclerc comes in. He's hungry. He's passionate. He's different. He didn't really, he was very raw last year. Didn't have a lot of respect for team games, if you like. So I think Vettel was almost caught off guard last year. I think Vettel thought he was going to have Leclerc in his pocket, and it didn't quite turn out like that, and it's almost himself to blame that Ferrari have sort of went, no, right, you've had your chance now, you've had 5 years or whatever, and you haven't delivered us what we want, so we're now going to focus on Charles, and rightly or wrongly, that's what's happened.
And a pattern, isn't it? I never thought it would happen with Vettel. It happened with Massa, with Kimi, and Alonso obviously up sticks of his own accord, but I never imagined it would happen to Vettel. And now in 2021 we have a lineup of Leclerc and Sainz. We've been through all of those 4 drivers. How much do you blame Ferrari in this instance? Because I think that going through this has certainly shown me that maybe it's not the team necessarily that's caused the problem. I think that particularly in the case of Fernando Alonso, the team, he was incredibly unlucky. Felipe Massa was never the same after that 2009 crash. Again, things that Ferrari can't control. Kimi was just too chilled, wanted that ice cream and couldn't care less about anything else as long as he was still racing. And with Sebastian Vettel, well, 999 times out of 1,000 he'd have won at least one championship. I know Ferrari's the common denominator, but were Ferrari the problem or not? That's the question. This podcast.
What we haven't touched on, throughout this is Ferrari's strategy team over the last 2 years and how they always seem to be outthought and outmaneuvered Ferrari. Certainly the last 2 years, Mercedes seem to, and Red Bull, to be fair, both of those teams seem to be one step ahead of the game. I think Ferrari haven't developed well, in any of the years. They've always started out with a decent car, or the opposite. They've started out with a really poor car and have been unable to develop it. So I think from that point of view, Ferrari are to blame for these drivers because they've got so much prestige, have Ferrari. It's like the Man United effect, if you like. Ferrari were this dominant team of yesteryear, and they've still got this reputation, and everyone wants to drive for them and to work for them. But actually, they haven't been successful since 2008. They haven't had the fastest car since 2007, arguably. So I think Ferrari are, half of the blame at the very least. But I think they've almost been guilty of giving their drivers too comfortable a time. First with Alonso, and then with Vettel. And I think Alonso got a little bit big for his boots by the end of it, and thought he was this great driver, and couldn't see himself finishing sixth in a championship for Ferrari, although he would never ever finish. He might have finished in the top 10 once again in his career, and Vettel, couldn't bear to be upstarted again like he was at Red Bull. So yeah, I think Ferrari do have some portion of the blame.
It's a fair point. It certainly is a fair point. I mean, in some parts they've had the best car, but as you say, they've never had the full package. I feel like that's been shown a lot in the last few years with Mercedes being so dominant. Beforehand they were kind of in it, and other teams went up and down, but with Mercedes being so dominant, it's been shown all the more. But I think for Ferrari to really change, there's got to be a change of philosophy, which I think there is with this new driver lineup, and I think they've got to change the philosophy now. That the Ferrari's always been seen as that team that, well, they've been in it for the longest. The name of Ferrari, they've got to be at the top. I think Ferrari have just got to accept, a little bit like McLaren have now, that they're not top dog, and have got to almost rip up the rule book in terms of their team, try and take out of some of the politics and start from the beginning, because that's exactly what McLaren have done, and it's worked. Yeah. And Ferrari are just going to keep going this way. I mean, I'm excited about Sainz and Leclerc, and can't see that going wrong really, but could anyone see Vettel and Raikkonen going wrong? And Raikkonen and Alonso, two monstrous driver lineups, but never really materialised anything. So what do you see the next few years looking like for Ferrari?
I think it's going to be exciting. I think first and foremost they've got to get the car right. As we've said, they haven't had the fastest car for many years now, and it's almost like the early 90s with Ferrari, where I think people expected stuff of them because of the name, and then it wasn't really until the late 90s that they started turning that around, and I think they did have that reset when they signed Schumacher. I think they had that long-term project in mind. I think they've currently had the philosophy of instant win, with Vettel and Alonso. But now I think with Sainz and Leclerc, they've got that long-term vision. I think it's going to be really exciting to see, because I think people underestimate Sainz, because Sainz, for what it's worth, is equal to Verstappen, over their years racing together at Toro Rosso. There wasn't anything between them, really. So
No.
I think that'll be really exciting. And I think Sainz has got a bit of an edge to him as well that people don't necessarily know about. I think Sainz will not just, bend over backwards for Leclerc. I think Sainz will try and race for himself, and I think we're really in store for maybe a Hamilton-Rosberg V2, really.
I think we are. I think we are, and I think the exciting bit as well is that Carlos Sainz gets on very well with Fernando Alonso. He'll be drawing for Alonso's experience and probably asking him for a lot of advice, particularly now going to Ferrari and how to handle that, because driving for McLaren's one pressure, but going to Ferrari, I mean, it's still quite unbelievable that a driver of Carlos Sainz has gone to Toro Rosso, then to Renault, then to McLaren, and then has gone to Ferrari. It's really a shame he didn't go back to Renault and then Ferrari to do the almost a Fernando Alonso career move, but quite unbelievable, really. But as I said, it's one thing driving for McLaren, then to come to Ferrari, the pressure of Leclerc being there as well. These are exciting times for Ferrari. But we've looked at the last 13 years, from 2007 to 2020. Amazingly, since 2007, there's not been a championship for Ferrari. Maybe there might be in the next decade, but I'm sure that we'll be bringing you plenty of shows in the next decade about Formula 1 and all in the world of sports and game. But you've been listening to Joe and Toby tonight on a discussion of Ferrari's fall from grace, and I hope you have enjoyed. If you have enjoyed, make sure to go and follow the podcast on the Spotify page, where you will receive all notifications as where the podcasts come out on that platform. We're also looking to get the podcast on other platforms as well, other podcasting platforms such as Apple Podcasts. But for the moment, you're going to have to deal with it being on YouTube and on Spotify. But Spotify is the best place to find us. That is where the podcasts go up first and foremost, and then the podcasts are also released on our YouTube channels, Captain Goodspeed and TIJ Gaming. You can get involved with us on those YouTube videos. There'll usually be a premiere of these podcasts as well, over on Captain Goodspeed's channel, where you can get involved live in the chat and of course suggest your ideas down in the comments. But this podcast is all about you guys enjoying it, and your feedback is well appreciated. We're 2 episodes into the new podcast, and I have really enjoyed this episode and the last episode, and expect many podcasts in the near future. So any final words, Joe?
No, I think just we're all looking forward to F1 being back whenever it does, and I think we are in for a really exciting time over the next few years with all this development.
Yeah, I definitely. I couldn't agree more. I am really excited with the return of Formula 1, and when it does return, we'll be there. We'll be discussing the first few races, not necessarily in race reviews, but we'll be discussing deep dives on Formula 1, snooker, football, all the world of sport, and the sports of gaming, right? And the world of gaming, I meant, not the sports of gaming. See, it's recorded live and not edited. That's if you couldn't tell, that is, it's recorded live with no editing. But I hope you've enjoyed. I've been Toby and he's been Joe, and I suppose in true to Ronnie's style, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.